All right, so what's up, YouTube? Welcome to the Unity Podcast. This is our first episode here with Max Lyon. So Max and I have known each other for about 10 years, and we haven't talked much recently, but we used to talk a lot about similar ideas, actually. We had a lot of conversations when I was kind of more in my agnostic kind of phase, where I was questioning things related to religion, but I wasn't quite, overtly religious like how I feel I am now. And yeah, and so, Max has some questions for me that he'd like to talk about. And yeah, and so we're kind of hoping that, this turns into an interesting discussion that you all enjoy viewing. Yeah, and so at this point, I'll turn it over to Max and you can go away with whatever questions you have.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Nick. Thanks for having me on. Yeah, it's been a while since I feel like we used to kind of have those late night discussions hashing out philosophy a little bit more in the past, but it's good. I really have been liking the content that you've been putting out on your YouTube channel,
Thank
like
you. Thank you.
very thought provoking and just like really interesting way of looking at things that I hadn't really thought of that way before. I had I guess, some connections going on when you were talking about like the kind of the idea of this theology based view of ideas and how like those could represent a god. And it almost what it made me think of then was kind of Greek mythology and Roman mythology, and almost how like when you're thinking of it from that perspective, it's almost like each idea is a god. Like you have a
Yeah.
god of agriculture or
Yeah.
love or
Yep.
war, and it's
Exactly.
almost
Yep.
them sorting themselves
Yeah.
out into the importance of the
Exactly.
hierarchy
Yep.
in society. And I was like, I don't know, that was just how that kind of that that I guess what it was almost pagan. I guess anything that's not like Judeo-Christian, I guess, is pagan to a certain extent, or anything polytheistic. But how that kind of gave way to this more monotheistic belief. It's almost like they had hashed themselves, their belief system,
Right.
came in to
Right.
solidify, and now talking about kind of the true ideal of this divine kind of God, the ultimate, like kind of
Right.
Christian God that we know in the Ten Commandments, and bringing it down to like what's best to be a productive society, like what's best for humanity.
Yeah,
Um,
no, definitely. And so I definitely agree with like kind of the Greek mythology, and if you trace some of these stories actually back in history, so Jordan Peterson talks about this. I want to give credit where credit is due. And I believe it's Babylonian culture that there's this god that he talks about, this god Marduk, or Marduk or something like this. That you can kind of see in the history that it was actually just as you said. It was kind of like a battling out between gods that represented actually like morals and values that kind of guided a society. And then as these societies started to merge together, and like bigger and bigger societies kind of came together from smaller tribes that were all now living under one umbrella. It was like each tribe came with its own gods, so to speak, that were kind of like representations of their values that kind of like glued their tribe together. But then when tribes came together to form these larger civilizations, there was actually like in the stories there's a battling out of their gods, and then kind of what came out of that is this god Marduk that like essentially what defined Marduk was the fact that he had eyes all the way around his head and he spoke magic words. And so it's something like someone that pays attention and has awareness and that is able to like concisely articulate his views is the symbol of, like kind of who you should be and what a leader should be is, so it's not a tyrant. It's not someone that just rules with an iron fist. It's someone that like pays attention to his people and is able to articulate his ideas in a compelling way. And
Yeah, like observant and observant and articulate as to what the needs of society are, because you're
exactly,
actually paying attention to them.
exactly, yeah,
Yeah, I mean,
yeah.
hopefully our modern leaders should take note of that.
Yeah,
But
well, hopefully if we get religion back in back as like, a primal thing, that's kind of like my goal. But
got you. Yeah, I guess to preface a little bit too, I should explain. Like I'm just to give the audience a little bit of a perspective. I would say I'm agnostic. I don't discount. I'm very very open to any ideas. I'm being where I'm at in my life, I guess finding purpose and value in anything can be difficult. It's like, kind of like what you were talking about that kind of it's almost like a sense of nihilism. And I believe that there's a freedom in that same belief system where it's like, I actually give purpose to my life, and it can just be it's wavering. It's almost like being like an entrepreneur as opposed to working for a corporation. You don't have that that concise paycheck, but you're making your own way. Um, but yeah,
Sure,
so
sure,
I don't
sure.
I don't have I don't personally I don't believe in any higher power. But I'm open to all things. So I guess I just wanted to give some context. So I'm just kind of explain. I guess I shouldn't say what camp I come from, but kind of what my belief system currently is. Um, but I just wanted to have a couple more comments before I get into the content. One of the
Yeah,
funny
certainly.
things when you were talking about Harry Potter being essentially the Bible, I have a good quote from Billy. You know him. I don't know if anyways, but he said every story is the Bible. Whenever
No,
we'll get into
it's
we'll
actually
get
true. It's actually in
yeah
some sense true. Yeah, yeah. Because like the Bible, I believe the word even means the book, and so for the longest time, like that was the story that people had, and so like you can kind of any story you see trace it back in some sense to the Bible as like the origin of a lot of these stories. Yeah, so there's always almost every story there is a connection back to the Bible in some sense. Yeah,
yeah, the archetype of the story is like
right.
it's really at the heart of it's every story now, and I'm
Sure.
not sure.
Yeah.
It's like I mean, imagine the audacity to write the story, and then like yeah, people have to be writers after this. Like I don't know if it made it harder or easier. I mean,
No,
we
sure.
keep having the same movie and same books over and over, so maybe it's
What's really
maybe there's something to
interesting
it.
what's really interesting though is I think a lot of people view the Bible as a static document, but it's actually not. So it's so like a couple things. One, every time we translate it, it actually is modifying it. It's shaping it and it's changing it. And then also like there's certain conceptions that, especially when I talk to people that think are part of like the let's say the Christian canon that like comes from the Bible, but it's not. It's actually part of cultural things, like things from like Dante's Inferno or Paradise Lost or some of these other things. But then they've kind of been integrated into what is considered like the Christian canon, and they came way after Jesus Christ was around. I mean, it came you know even thousands of years later, or like over 1,000 years later. Some of these big stories actually have modified how we actually view religion, and it's considered canonical. Like the image of who Satan is not in the Bible at all. And then the description of hell as a place is not in the Bible at all. But then it's like people have this conception. So like it is definitely true that the stories. So it's not even just that the stories originate from the Bible in a lot of ways. Like there's a root back to the Bible, but then the stories also inform the Bible and update the Bible and change it. Like it is a living, breathing document. It's not a static, stationary document. And yeah, I don't know if a lot of people are like fully aware of that. I know at least I wasn't.
Yeah. Yeah, I mean, I don't to be honest with you, I don't know that much about the Bible. I know like Old Testament, New Testament, but like for instance, like Dante's Inferno, I don't know if that's just a story that's spun off from the Bible. Is that part of the Bible? I don't have a good background in theology, so
Look, I
um
don't really much either, but like I'm in a process of kind of learning these things, and like these are things that I'm discovering along the way, which I don't know. It was actually really exciting to me to realize that it's like, okay, this actually isn't a static document, and like this is like it kind of embeds us in a story, but we're part of the story, and then we update the story that then goes into the next generation. So it's not just this was told and then that's just the way it is forever. It's like
yeah.
it's a living, breathing document that like our lives actually are going to shape this document for future generations, which is there's something exciting about that.
Are you saying we may need like a New Testament, like the newer testament? Are we due for a rewrite?
I mean, so people actually ask me this, right? It's like the question is kind of like, you know, when I kind of talk to people about my ideas, like a lot of people are kind of like, okay, yeah, this sounds really cool, but then, why don't we just have a new religion? And like, I mean, maybe a New Testament is a good answer, because like as long as like I think there's always I believe that it's important to have a tension between tradition and progression, right? And it's if you get too trapped, I'm definitely like I'm going to be quoting Dr. Peterson here, but like if you get too trapped in tradition and order, then it becomes constraining and suffocating and tyrannical. But then if you have too much progress, then it's just chaotic and you don't have any foundation to kind of like ground yourself in. So Like there needs to constantly be a dialogue between like modernity and modern ideas and tradition. So the idea of a new religion, like I'm not totally opposed to it, but I think that new religion needs to bake in, all the this, basically all of human history that's kind of encapsulated in these traditional religions, and it needs to integrate that somehow into a new religion. But to me, it's like, well, at that point, why don't we just update the current system? And
Yeah.
yeah,
Yeah, I was gonna say, I think the modernization of it, and I think that's kind of actively happening if you look at it. At least, I don't know for sure, but just kind of based off of the attention that religion seems to be getting currently, and just off the the bigger prominent names that are starting to come about in the platforms they're getting. I'm guessing that there's a decent amount of interest into this. So I don't know how, like I said, I have no background in theology, but maybe it's actively happening. I don't know, like, at what point do you go, okay, we have a new religion, or is this something that people look at to the history and go, this is when there was a shift, and start, calling it to something else? Maybe this stuff never
sure.
ends up happening till later,
Yeah,
however
like
history is written.
yeah, it seems to be pretty rare that there's like a strong, just like radical shift, unless a radical thing happens. And, uh, yeah, so like, I don't rule it out, but you know, I definitely think that, like, I think obviously the traditional religion that like definitely we saw as kids and our parents saw is not working. Like something about it is problematic. Something about it is not resonating. I mean, like the percentage of young kids that are actually going to church has just like completely fallen off a cliff. And or at least young kids, maybe their parents put them in it, but then when they get to an age where they can kind of make a decision, they leave it, and like it's not compelling. There's something about it that's not compelling, and so it needs some form of revitalization. And whether that means, you know, actually revitalize what we currently have, or that means try something new, uh, yeah, I think kind of only time will tell. But yeah,
Yeah, I think just last point on that would be what the talk that you sent me with the four speakers. I'm not super familiar with them all yet, but Jordan Peterson was talking about or I guess they were all talking about this, but the idea that you know Jordan Peterson's going through it and having this experience of reading the Bible as, and he's not sitting there assuming that he knows everything. Like, he's not sitting there being like, oh, I got a degree in theology, so I'm going to sit up here and tell you about what this is, or like, it's that kind of like, you're not like, don't be my dad. Like, we're like, I want to go through this as, equals, as like we are both, imperfect humans, and we're trying to sort of way through it. And I think that's the approach that really, that I
I
mean,
agree.
that's what we're all
I
looking
agree.
for, right? That's what we're all doing here. At the
I
end of the
agree.
day,
Right.
I've known since I was 9 years old that nobody has any idea what's going on. Like, you know what I mean? I
Well,
started
that's
to see
young. Yeah,
through
it
the
took me till I was
BS.
28 or something, but yeah, it's a
Yeah, I
bit. Yeah,
started to see through the BS at 9 years old, man. Like that,
yeah,
I was like, you
yeah.
guys literally are just all pretending to be adults. Like, nobody act there. This is chaos. You know what I mean? Well,
No,
not
sure.
pure chaos, but like, most people are just faking their way through. Like the structure, the teachers didn't really want to be there. They didn't really know how to deal with all these kids. The parents were learning how to parent as they were doing it. And like, I figured that out pretty quickly. So like, I guess that's probably a reason why religion, at least when I was early, introduced to it, it was people that didn't know what they were talking about telling me something about how I should live my life. And that
Yeah,
didn't work well for me in school. It doesn't work well for me in religion. And I
yeah.
think that going through it with like someone that's an equal and going like, we're trying to understand this together, really like a more humble approach, I think, in most things is a better approach, and it's going to make people feel more welcome and more part of it, and not like the whole like shame and hellfire and brimstone thing. Obviously not good.
Well,
People are just going to be like, no, we're not doing that.
this is one thing I've been thinking about. Okay, well, there's a couple things in that actually. But the whole like shame idea is it's funny because it's actually anti-Christian. Like it's by the Christian's own definition. It's literally satanic.
Mm.
To do that, right? Because like, what is satanic? Kind of is that which divides us, and that's what happened, right? So I mean, it's like even by the own like traditional views of Christianity, like that idea of shaming people is satanic. Like like that's the wrong approach. Like, and it's you know, so I'm totally on board with you with that. That cannot be the correct way to go about trying to deliver this message, because what it does is it creates an exodus and it divides us, and like that's literally the definition of that which is satanic. like by
Yeah.
Christians' own terms. So it's it's like that isn't it. That is not the correct way to be doing this. And yeah, so I'm fully on board with that.
Yeah, so let me see. One of the other things I guess I kind of want to I don't want to spend too much time going over old stuff, but I'll just tell you some of the other things that jumped out at me real quick was when you're talking about the imperfectness of like, so you're talking about the square, and there's like a square, the square is more real than the imperfect desk that was
Okay.
built based
Uh-huh.
on the square. And it made me think of like, the Bible, and like when it comes to it, it's like I think you were probably implying this through the story, but like how the Bible is like the perfect book it's like, well, in theory, right?
Hmm.
So it's the idea they were trying to make it, but humans are imperfect, and the
Sure.
outcome is
Right.
going to be imperfect. You can
Right.
design it in AutoCAD, right? But when you build the desk, it doesn't
Right.
come out a perfect square, and that's the kind of the idea I was getting from what you portrayed when you were explaining the Bible, and I really kind of liked that because it's almost like when you take it from being the stories in the Bible, or just take the idea of Jesus Christ and take it from being literal to making it figurative, right? Then it just makes sense of it's almost like the idea of mathematics to the desk. It's the
Sure.
idea of Jesus Christ to yourself, you know?
Yeah. So like Jesus Christ is a tricky one, right? Because like in the Christian dogma, like that's literal. Like that was historically accurate event that Jesus Christ was the Son of God, came down to Earth, and kind of like
Allegedly.
right. No,
Sorry.
fair enough, man. Like, and this is why I actually had one of my friends that watches my videos also like kind of made a comment about this, and then on my last video, and it was kind of like I don't know if you're actually a Christian, because like they believe these things are literal, and it's like that's a fair critique, and I don't know if I am either, because like that's a fucking hard thing to believe. It's I mean it's like literally unbelievable, but then like certain like Christian theologians and other like practitioners of Christianity would say that's like the point. Like if it's not unbelievable, you're not thinking about this right. It is unbelievable, and then it's actually. I mean, it's like it's it's wild. Like it's just a historic event, and so
I
I'm not
I
sure
feel
where I stand on this. Whether I have fully accepted that that is literally true or if it's just figuratively true. But what I would say is it's not clear to me actually which one is harder to believe. Whether the fact that it wasn't true, but that the story was invented, or that it was literally true. They're both like almost equally as unbelievable to me, and I don't know the answer. Like I'm close to like 50-50 on this
his,
because go ahead. Yeah.
history isn't that hard to rewrite.
Well,
I believe. So
but it has a potent effect though, right? Because it's like you could say like, okay, this was just a story that someone fabricated, but then it's like, okay, well, first off, how do you come up with this story? The story is just so
could
unimaginable,
just also be embellished,
right?
Like,
But
was
then
it
if
really the Son of God?
right,
Also,
but humans are like we're pretty smart, like we're really good at detecting bullshit, and
my
this
meter's going
story
off.
is no, look, man, fair enough. Me too, but this thing has survived for thousands of years, and I'm not trying to like, I'm not trying to like, I honestly don't know where I stand on this one, and
Yeah.
so if that makes me not a Christian, fair enough. But
Yeah.
then, like, I would say that it's actually hard also to believe that this was a fabricated story. Like they're both equally. I don't know about equally, but they're both challenging and hard for me to accept because if it
Yeah.
is bullshit and was fabricated, like after Christ died, like it was like people were trying to wipe out Christians left and right. They were crucifying a bunch of people, and people were just like so devoted to this that they were willing to sacrifice themselves and they were willing to be crucified. And it's like that it takes you have to see something miraculous and to actually be willing to be that devoted to something. Like I don't know if I've ever been that devoted to anything that I would be willing to actually be hung on a fucking cross for a belief, unless that belief is something that literally just completely blew my mind. And
Yeah.
so it's all I'm trying to say here is that it's like I agree with you. It's hard to buy whether that story is literal, but it's also in the historical context. It's also challenging to believe that it was complete bullshit. And so
Yeah.
I
No,
don't know. I don't
I
know
hear
where I
you.
stand. I'm agnostic on this one, but yeah,
So I totally think that I'm totally in. It's in the realm of possibility that there was a guy named Jesus, and that he did believe in the things he was saying and take some of these actions that are written about. But have you ever watched this show Black Mirror?
Yep. Yep.
Have you seen the second episode of the first season
Maybe. What's
with
the?
the guy riding the bicycle? He has to ride the bicycle for the credits, and then like his
Yes. Yes. Actually. Yes. Yeah.
you
Yep.
remember
Yep.
the end when he
Uh-huh.
gets on the talk show with the thing, and then they
Mm-hmm.
just commoditize it and they sell it.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah,
Right. But here's the thing. Well,
how do you
okay.
know that wasn't the case?
I don't. I'm not going to sit here and say that like that isn't the case. That could be the case. But to me, it's
Something that
there's
upsets the power
something
structure.
like there's something
It's
about us that as humans, like maybe I'm just like more kind of white pilled on this. That I think like I just have like a lot of faith in humanity. That like the I just don't think just complete and utter bullshit is propagated through billions of people over thousands of years. Like, I mean, it could be the case, but it seems like that to me is actually hard to believe. That is very hard
well,
to believe that that's the case too. So it's
well, isn't that what fables are though? Like fables, like
what
I
do you
don't
mean
know.
by that?
So the purpose of this is not the story itself. It's the morals that are taught through the story. That's what fables are. Like this to
Sure.
me is bordering along the lines of fable or truth. One, because it's so historically close to now. It's not that long ago.
Sure.
2,000 years is really not a long time ago when all things are
But
considered.
also, how many stories have been forgotten a decade later? Like
Yeah,
100 years later.
yes,
Yeah, no. But
but we're talking about the ultimate story. We're talking about the Bible. I mean, it's the
sure,
most printed
sure,
book. I mean, except for maybe Harry Potter, but
sure.
yeah, no, it's really one of the most propagated stories. And as we know now, like historically, like Christianity takes from, like you had said before, these pagan religions. There's a lot of belief systems and values that were like merged into this thing. So like
Sure.
how many of the stories in the Bible are ain't like old pagan tales that were
Uh-huh.
then adapted by some subset of the society that for whatever reason I don't know
Where
who
did
wrote
these
the
tales
Bible,
come
but
from, though?
let's say I think one of these guys was named John, but let's say John, you know what I
Hmm.
mean, where he got some of his stories from, like where's that influence, these stories, like isn't there's a story about like a giant, right? There's like the David versus Goliath. That's in the Bible, right?
Hmm.
So that's in the Bible, right? With the giant. I'm sure that there wasn't a giant. Positive, right? Like
Well, it
there's
depends on what you
absolutely
mean by there wasn't a giant, but I think I know
but
what you mean. Sure.
but what we're talking about is a figurative story. What the important part of that story is the moral. And that's what I think that that's what I think the focus of the story of Jesus Christ should be on,
Right,
is the
but
moral actual practice. If you get hung up on whether or not it was historically accurate, I think we're missing the point, right? And I think that it's not I think
except in the
to
story of
require
Jesus. Like
I guess
it's
I guess
important for the Christian canon, but this is also why I'm
but
partially like I don't know if I can fully say that I'm a Christian.
But
But
but here's the thing: is the entire thing about religion, spirituality, your relationship with God, and your relationship towards going towards that divine truth, or
mhm.
is it about you agreeing to give up some of your control by agreeing that this far-fetched story is true, and you just have to have faith in it? What part of that whole thing
Well,
requires you to do that besides some organized religion trying to get you into that slippery slope of control, right? And
well,
I just
here's the
don't.
thing. What I
That's
would
why I'm
say.
super defensive against that.
Here's what I would say, and so I talked about this in my first video that was like a real video of like I don't think any of us are actually really in control of our own choices. Like there's something beyond us that is controlling us already. Like that's already true. And so then like I think the appropriate way to tie into these things is that like I think that most of these religious tales and the reason these stories actually resonate. So like maybe it is a tale, but then even a tale needs to be true, right? Because otherwise you don't buy it. Like if I tell you this story, like, and I just say like, oh, if you, I don't know, if you like put your socks under your pillow, then you're gonna wake up with tons of riches. You're just gonna be like, get the fuck out of here. That sounds ridiculous. Like that's not a fable that's gonna propagate over time because it's kind of like, okay, that's ridiculous. But if I tell you a story that like seems to actually grip you, and there's something about it that like there's a part of you that says there's something true to this, but it's not the propositional part of you. So this is John Vervecki's language, where he talks about different modes of knowing something, right? And you have propositional knowledge, which our society has definitely overemphasized, and that's like the realm of science. Like you use like rationality and reason and logic to start from some set of like beliefs that you hold, and then try to, go from there to actually understand something. But then there's other forms of knowing something. Like you might like, listen to a song, and then the music, there's something about it that just grips you. And so you know something, but you might not even be able to articulate what it is. Or you might have some epiphany, and then you try to write down what the epiphany was, and it's like really hard to actually articulate. So there's like deeper or other forms of knowing something. And what I would say is that for a story to actually have like to resonate with you, it has to be resonating with other forms of knowledge beyond this. And if I just tell you a story that's just like not resonating with any part of you, like I don't think it would have the same potency and effect, and then the same, like drive to actually induce faith in something that, unless there's something true about it. And this is a different kind of true than what people like traditionally think of when they think of scientific truths. But yeah,
Yeah,
that's kind
yeah.
of what I would
So
say.
along those lines, I feel like so when you were explaining that to me, it what felt to me is like you're kind of taking kind of Christian um like verbiage or something like that, or a terminology to try to answer something that's hard to convey the idea around. And I think that's what we are kind of through a nurture of like our Western, upbringing, is like that's what we're kind of trained to do. Sorry, trained is might not be the best term there, but
Well, it's
that's
accurate though, because you impartially are. You partially are,
yeah.
right? Yeah.
Yeah, you're essentially indoctrinated with a
Sure.
certain
Yeah.
set
Sure.
of like we all know these it's all been imposed on us in some, or what is it, the word I'm looking for, imprinted on us in one way or another. And I think that like most of this stuff can actually be explained through the subconscious and kind of like evolutionary biology. And so I think a lot of the things that you think of in terms of that as like a higher power is actually like subconsciousness, and it has to do with like generational hand-downs of knowledge through our DNA. You know what I mean? Like we are,
Yeah.
through being a human being, and we might be describing the exact same thing, but where I see it as coming from is through the subconscious and through generational learning, through that generational knowledge that we are, we're born with these things. It's just part of what being any living creature on this planet is, right? Like,
Mhm.
you look at a deer or you look at any other animal, from its birth it knows how to do certain things. It's aware of certain predators. It's like you're the creature is formed not just there from its birth, but from the beginning of its time, its ancestors. It's all in there. So I think that there's a lot of stuff that speaks to that. I also think that um I don't know. I haven't done a ton of research on this, but I was reading Consciousness Explained by Daniel Dennett, and so I found a lot of kind of, I guess, some of my thoughts might be like kind of influenced through that. But that's I don't know, that I felt like I found a lot of answers that I could kind of explain that these same phenomenons through that sort of verbiage, or through that perspective, rather than through like a Christian one. And I'm not saying that they're even necessarily different. I think it might just be semantics. Like you might just be explaining the same thing in different ways.
Yeah. So like my response to that is great. Like good. Like I mean, if the ideas that are being talked about in kind of a standard Christian and other religious language is being discovered by science, like that sounds awesome. Like that's great that somehow you can recover this from an approach that's evolutionary, like grounded in evolutionary biology or something else. Great. Like I think that that's great, and I think in a lot of ways what uh, religion is it's like I try to, the way that I view it is it's a phenomenology, and so and like what I mean by that is it's just a description of experience, and it's a description of being itself, and it's kind of like, hey, there's these experiences that happen, and then we can, and there's certain patterns in experience itself, and there's patterns that we all seem to run into, and there's certain things, if you act certain ways, certain things happen, and then there's certain things that I can't explain, and then we come up with a terminology and an entire vocabulary and dictionary to understand certain experiences that we already have, and then to try to make sense of the world. And so I yeah, so what I would say is, if this can be explained by another means, to me that means that whatever, like if kind of the way that religious language and religious terminology is explaining something is completely in agreement with some scientific thing, to me that's an indication that it's more true. Like that means that whatever it is that we're trying to get at, like if we can get at it from multiple different angles, we get at the same thing. Like ultimately what I'm interested in is the underlying truth of things. And I think that the religious lens is a framework, and it's a like, I view it as a model, and like maybe this is inspired because I'm a physicist, and so you know eat, sleep, and breathe models like all the time. And so like in some sense I really do view all this stuff as the same thing as quantum mechanics, right? So if you look at quantum mechanics, I mean, it says, okay, the electron is described by a wave function, and then it says that the electron can be here and there at the same time, and if it goes this way in this pattern, it can go around one path and around another path, and then they talk to each other, but it's integral that the electron actually went in two places at the same time, and like it has this kind of, you know, like this is the story of the electron in some sense. But if you just look at the story, you look at quantum mechanics, you ask, is that real? Or is that true? It's kind of like, well, it's a phenomenology. It's a way to describe what's going on that leads to predictions and leads to things that you can act out and see, does it agree with the story in some sense. And to me, it's like I literally don't see a difference between quantum mechanics and the Bible. Like
Yeah.
the Bible is now, it's a model that makes predictions about modes of being. It's like act in a certain way, have a certain set of principles that orient your life, and see what happens. And
Yeah.
it's kind of like, okay, well, there's a pattern in the ways of acting, and then they've been articulated and made concise and abstracted into stories to tell to other people to kind of, lay down what are the principles and what is the outcome and what is the prediction, and it provides you a framework, and it's a model to tell you, like, essentially what's going to happen if you act out certain principles in the exact same way that quantum mechanics will tell you that, here's what's going to happen if you do this experiment with electrons or whatever. It's like, to me, I don't know if you can see where I'm coming from, or if this is just because I've been thinking about this for several years to the point that I view these as equivalent. But
no, it makes sense to me. It does.
okay,
I really liked the when you talked about like the idea of the scientific, like a scientific theory, and like it's about being able to, if you apply this, like have like an expected outcome, right? Whereas like the Bible, it's almost the same thing. It's like if you like, it's modeled. It's
Mhm.
that's something I wanted to talk about too. It's like talking about, so the way that I think these things are parallel, like what I'm talking about from an evolutionary biology type of standpoint, like my background and the way that I see these things, it's tomato tomato. It's the way you want to describe it, because we're not inventing anything here. Like you spoke about in one of your videos, we are just describing something that's happening, a phenomenon that's happening. And kind of like what I said in the comment on the video of I believe that, so it's almost like the story of the Bible, right? So you have some sort of experience that you have. Now you want to teach someone else through that experience. Now you were kind of talking about like, here's my story. I go and do, I wake up in the morning and I do this and I do that. It's not nowhere near as interesting as if you create a fable, some sort of captivating story that at the end of the day, the point is getting in a way that's going to keep someone's attention and make them feel connected to a character that you've created, some sort of moral, teaching in that. And I feel like this is the same thing with what religion is, with Christianity is to the explanation of, like, from an evolutionary biological standpoint that I would like to make. And it's really that I wrote this down. It was kind of that religion is like the personification, like having like a God, a Jesus is the personification of the evolutionary truth that the success of the species relies on those fundamentals. These are ways that you
Yeah, sure. I
behave.
like that. I like
These,
that. Yeah,
yeah. So
yeah.
these are ways that us as a species, to ensure our success, have been passed down through DNA. You know what I mean? And through some of it's also through, some nature, some nurture. I think it's, an equal hand in both. You can see kind of I would say that it's more of the nature side we're talking about. We're talking about subconscious. We're talking about kind of
Oh,
inherited truths
yeah.
that we don't really, like you're saying, you're asking a question. You don't know where the answer comes from, right? That's like inherited DNA truth to me. That's
Well,
where I
here's
think
the
that comes
interesting.
from.
Well, okay, there's also epigenetic phenomena, right? Where so like there's actually some research on this, and so I haven't read the studies myself, but I uh, saw I think he's a psychologist that was talking about this. That essentially, like for example, like if my grandfather liked a particular girl in his life, that actually will modify the attraction that I have, and so it's somehow your experience actually modifies your genetics that are passed on uh like to the next generation. So it's actually hard to tease these apart. And then yeah, there was something else that I while you were saying this I wanted to say, but I it's not coming to mind. So yeah. Yeah, there if it comes to me I'll try to blurt
Yeah,
it
and
out,
then
but
yeah, I guess the second part of that I wrote, I just wanted to say, let's see. Oh man, that is some. Oh yeah, so we kind of unpack this like history of evolution, of like of our consciousness through like religion or greater philosophical study. That's kind of what we're doing, is unpacking that and trying to like explain it. And we use this kind of like almost the same way it is essentially a fable to explain something that's hard, very hard for us to articulate or explain, because we're coming to awareness of it as we go. You know what I mean? And I don't know.
sure.
That's kind of the
Oh,
way that I view it. But
so this
love
is what I
to.
wanted to yeah, that's what I wanted to talk about. So like in some sense when you look at these stories, like I think it's important to think, and I think this is kind of what you're getting at, is it's like you don't like the fact that it's kind of like, okay, the story's written, and then now someone's telling you here's how you should be, right? But then it's like what I always try to think about is where did this come from, right? Like there are, there's. I remember when I was a kid, like it almost seemed like the Bible. It was like one day it was like the sky opened and then these stone tablets like came down from the heavens and boom, this is the word of God. God has spoken. And it's kind of like I just in no way do I think that that's like literally true. Like,
Yeah.
but in this like narrative world, like in this figurative language, it almost is true, but it's not. I don't think that that's literally true. Like what it is it's as you were saying, it was like people are acting this stuff out, and they're kind of like it's kind of like okay, a bunch of societies formed, right? And then you have a leader that sits at the top of the hierarchy that kind of like guides a civilization, and it's kind of leading a civilization. And then it's like certain leaders are good and certain ones are bad, and certain leaders, like when people are following this leader, like their entire tribe gets murdered, and the other ways it's like they follow this leader and then great things happen. And it's kind of like okay, what is the difference? Like what makes the best leader, right? And then the way that you can kind of articulate that is like you start to tell stories to try to understand and articulate what is the best leader. And in some sense, so like certain denominations of Christianity even call the God, like God, the King of Kings. So it's kind of like okay, you have this hierarchy at the top of it. You sit a king, and then you have so you have these actual like hierarchies of people. You have a civilization that has a ruler at the top of it, but then over time we place different rulers at the top of our civilization, right? And like it usually kind of emerges out of the civilization, but then there's different types of rulers, right? So there's like you could have a ruler that's like the kind of their belief is basically like okay, I'm just going to rule with an iron fist and be a tyrant, but then it like that doesn't work, like that doesn't stabilize a civilization, and then it's like this happens I guess in certain types of primates, I think like chimpanzees or something, where it's if they have a chimpanzee that runs the society like purely based on just dominance and kind of being tyrannical, then like and they've documented this. It's like two chimpanzees that are three-quarters as big will like tear him to pieces when he's sleeping, stuff. And so it's like okay, well, like that's not stable. Like that doesn't actually bind the society together and keep it thriving. And so it's kind of like okay, that principle is not the correct principle to place as like what should guide the leader for our society. And then it's kind of like okay, if you take these leaders, the leader has some like ideas that are kind of guiding him as a leader, and then you look at the leaders over time, and then there's each hierarchy has some leader that's kind of leading the society. But then you ask okay, now instead of looking at the leader that is at the top of one society You now extract out the leader and you form a hierarchy of leaders, right? And then it's kind of like, okay, what sits at the top of that? What is the king of kings? What is the best way to lead a society? And it's like that's the question that drives how to define God in some sense. Like God is the king of kings. He's like,
Yeah, well,
yeah,
I was just gonna say, I think that's well, I think that obviously perfection's unattainable, and I
right,
think
sure.
that one of the driving
But
forces
you
of
can articulate
humanity.
it, just like the
Oh yeah,
square. Right, right.
yeah, yeah. But one of the
Yeah,
driving forces of humanity is to always strive towards it, and that's an interesting phenomenon for sure. But I think this can also be explained. Uh, this is an and right. Like you can also explain this as that idea I was talking about. That's what's best for the success of the species through
sure,
historically through us coming from whatever mole creature we like evolved
sure,
from,
sure.
out of Jurassic period, up till now. It's like there's like this, like, and I wonder if this is true for all living things, like an ideal of like what it's trying to, what its perfect
Yeah,
form is,
sure.
right?
Right.
That it's always striving for,
Yeah.
simply because we are competing here against other life forms, and like our survival is not guaranteed, right? So like it's of the utmost importance for us to be striving towards it. So I think that it can be explained through God, but I also think that it's, whatever you want to call it, I think it is that ultimate, that perfection, something that's always unattainable but that we always strive for, and it's the driving force
Like
of life.
that's my definition though. So like you could say you can call that God, or you can say that that is God. Like that's the definition of God for me. Like a definition of God is like okay, like there's a couple ideas. So like in the Orthodox Christian view, there's this idea of theosis, and it's kind of like this is the idea of kind of what our role is as like what is our purpose here on Earth. And it was like well said by some father of the church that I don't remember, but it was something like God made humans so that humans could become God. And the idea is that like somehow what we're trying to do, and like kind of like this is something that like what is driving us, like what is the goal that like because we're progressing somewhere, like we're doing something, and it's kind of like okay, if you just step back and say what are we up to, what's the
Well, what is
goal,
all life?
and
What do you feel about all life?
sure,
Like, because I don't
fair
know.
enough, fair enough.
So I think so. Here, if we're gonna start discussing whether or not
Well, let me
God is
just
real, and it's,
let me just
go
finish
ahead,
the
go ahead.
like definition of like this idea of theosis. Like the idea
Yeah,
is
yeah.
though that what we're trying to do is be reunited with God in some sense. Like that's like in the if you take this framework, that's the idea. But God is like kind of the perfect mode of being in some sense, and in some sense. So if you buy the Christian story, then like Christ is the example of this, and he was reunited with God because he achieved the perfect mode of being. Um, but it's kind of like the idea of theosis is something like the goal that we're up to actually is to be reunited with God. We want to understand God and know God and become God, and that's like kind of the you can almost say that that's like a fantasy that drives the decisions that humans make.
Utopian, like a
And
utopian ideal.
yeah, and so this is going to be probably my next video. I'm actually going to like argue that that's actually the same idea in science. Like science is another example of this ideal that you're trying to actually like it's in some sense science is another instantiation of this idea of theosis to try to be reunited with God and try to come to know God and understand God. Mm.
Yeah, and I think that's the same driving force that I'm, essentially the same thing I'm explaining. I think we're talking, we're
Right,
just,
exactly. That's my
coming
point.
about
Yeah,
it from two, yeah,
I
in
agree.
parallel. So
Yeah,
yeah, that's interesting. So what was I gonna say? There was something else.
yeah. The hard part, and like, look, I was put off
Oh,
by religion for a long time, and I think it's important to try to bridge the gap, because it's. I think there's something about a priest in some suit that's always talking about God bless you, and this that's kind of just like, oh my God, like what the hell are you saying? And like it's kind of, I don't know,
like,
it's
oh my
like,
God, literally. No.
yeah, no, right? Yeah. And it took me a while to like finally accept, like, okay, this is what they're actually saying, and it took someone that kind of bridged the gap between kind of this like scientific type of way of thinking and the more traditional religious way.
Yeah, so I guess we kind of like alluded to this just when we were doing our tech setup, but I wanted to. So at what point though? I guess my question to you would be, like, what's the need for Christianity or a God for you in this? Like, if I could explain this all to you through evolutionary biology in a way that would make sense to you, that you would accept, like, what do you feel that the need? Do you because like for me, it almost seems like, the personification of these almost intangible ideas that I'm trying to explain, that I do not nor do I think our species has the full ability to dissect, the DNA to the point where we could, trace that all back and be like, oh, see, this is where all this all comes from, and you believe this because of that. But say one day we do, like, do you like? I guess what's your attachment to the Christian or to a God in general? Like, what need of that do you feel there is?
Yeah, so the best way to explain this is actually like a pretty, or at least where I'm coming from with this is like a pretty esoteric physics idea. I'll try here. So, like, okay, previously, before we knew that atoms existed, we had what we now call classical mechanics and classical physics. And so we had like thermodynamics is a good example. So in thermodynamics, it tells you, if you have different phases of matter and you have solids, but then, if you increase the temperature, it can melt into a liquid. And then we have, what happens if you kind of compress gases and if you don't, and different things like this. And it's, it has some description of kind of, what happens when you try to, exchange work into energy that you can use. And it's, it's like, actually, it's a really beautiful theory, and it, describes all these things. But then it was like, okay, it turns out that, like, when thermodynamics was invented, we didn't know that the atom even existed. Like, the concept of the atom had not been fully articulated at all yet. And like, certainly quantum mechanics wasn't a thing. And then you could say, okay, well, why do we need thermodynamics if now we have quantum mechanics? Like, we know that atoms exist, and we can just use quantum mechanics to try to explain all these things. And then, like, my subfield, that's, part of the goal is to try to do that, to try to, like, reproduce thermodynamics and maybe even extend it now that we know that quantum mechanics is a thing. But here's the thing is, it's like, okay, sometimes that's ridiculously complicated. Like, it's so complicated that it's like, so if I just took a chunk of metal that I that I can put on my desk, I just take a small amount, like, this literally has 10 to the power 23 atoms in it, like a chunk of metal that I can hold in my hand, which is like, if you had like a sheet, it's literally 1 trillion long and 1 trillion deep. And it might even be 1 trillion tall. Ridiculous number of atoms, absolutely outrageous number of atoms. And if you were to just throw on a computer, say like, okay, I want to solve the equations of quantum mechanics, if you had, I think might be like roughly 250 atoms, and you just say like, okay, I'm going to code this up, like run this for 250 atoms and hit start, it would literally take longer than the age of the universe to finish. And that's for 250 atoms, right? So if you wanted to do 1 trillion atoms, it's like, just forget about it. It's never going to happen.
Yeah.
And so then it's like, okay, well, fine, maybe some new theory comes out like quantum mechanics that then invalidates this. But it's like, like, it doesn't, because it's still, thermodynamics has a lot of explanatory power that quantum mechanics, even though it's technically more fundamental or something, or it's getting at something, it actually can't supplant thermodynamics, because thermodynamics, like, it assumes different things, but it can give us answer to these questions that quantum mechanics, like, without major breakthroughs. And I mean, like, the field that I'm in, we're trying to, resolve this problem and see, like, okay, is there a way that we can start with quantum mechanics and answer some of these questions? But it's insanely challenging. And so, I guess from my perspective, so there's two questions to this. One, from my perspective, it's kind of like, maybe science does start to answer these questions, and in which case I say great, right? Like, to me, it's, anything that can increase my understanding and knowledge of the world, I'm on board with. Like, that sounds great, right? And what I would say, though, is just the current form of religion already does that. It does that in a lot of ways. And so to me, it's like, like, I just view religion satisfying for a lot of these questions. And if science can address the same questions, awesome. Like, that, to me, that's great. Like, that's like a huge plus, and it just somehow validates religion in some sense. But then another thing I would say is, like, I actually don't think science is complete. Like, I think there are questions that science cannot answer. And one example of this is, what is science up to? Right? Like, why are we studying what we're studying? Like science is an epistemology. It's the philosophical term, which means it's the mode of understanding knowledge, right? But, like, science, the whole idea behind science is to remove the subject. And it's kind of like, okay, what we want to do is come up with this clinical procedure to understand the objective world by removing the subject. Like, I actually think that's technically impossible, but we try our best to like remove the subjective experience. But then like subjective experience is a big part of life. There's there's like what do we do with consciousness, and then so a lot of these like hard rational materialist rationalist type people that like really have just like essentially elevated science to the level of a new religion. They basically will just say like, oh, consciousness, like, oh, that's not even real, or like that's not a meaningful thing. And it's like, well, like I'm aware of things. I exist, like there's something about being itself, but it's like science almost can't address that. It can't like science is trying to understand the outside world, but then now take science and try to turn it back on itself and understand the subject, and it can't. Like it's designed not to. It's designed to remove the subject to understand the objective world. And then okay, so that's one aspect, but then also what is science up to? Like what's our goal? Like why are we studying quantum mechanics? Why are we studying cancer research? Why are we studying global warming? Why are we studying any of these things? And, I mean, no way saying we shouldn't do that, right? But I don't think science can answer that question.
Well, clearly because we're trying to understand the world around us, predict things better, come up with solutions more efficiently. That's
Well,
strictly why science
here's the
exists.
thing is, well, okay, you could say that that's obvious, but then like in science, now try to come up with a scientific experiment to verify that claim and to come up with support for that claim. Like it is kind of obvious. I agree with you. I agree with you. But then like maybe someone's skeptical and says, "Oh, that's not what we're up to. It's actually like, something else." And
Yeah. Well,
like,
then,
like,
but then you could use this. So then what you could do is you could use the scientific theory to go back to like early scientific discoveries and be like, okay, so you could run through like, well, I guess it might be hard to like do that exactly, but I guess you could run a simulation with people and have them try to figure out something about the the area that they're in to solve some sort of problem, and then they come up with some scientific solution, or they try to start imposing math or some other thing, strictly
sure.
to come up with a solution to a problem that's presented to them, or to gain more understanding about the world around them. I think that's I don't know if it necessarily requires a scientific like
Well,
I'm
all I'm
not
saying is
saying
this. I don't
yeah.
think science can actually answer that question. But like there is an answer to that question. Science can't answer it, and so then that means you need something. You need science plus something to actually like understand all the questions that could be understood. Like we are up to something. We're not randomly choosing. Although I do think some scientists actually kind of randomly choose, but for the most part we don't. I mean, like I think that there's an order to it. I mean, you could probably say I think it's a reasonable claim to say like, oh, we're doing cancer research because we want to preserve the life of those that we love and care about, and we want to make sure that we live longer and have healthier lives and stuff. And it's kind of like probably no one's going to argue with that, but you can't, like you could treat that as a propositional claim and say like conjecture. We're doing cancer research because we want to do such and such, but now come up with a scientific experiment to verify that or to support that claim. And I don't think you can. I don't like it. How would you even support that scientifically?
Well, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'm not a scientist. I don't do scientific
Fair enough.
studies
Fair enough.
enough to be
Sure.
able to come
Sure.
up with that. But
No, sure.
hopefully, some in the audience could answer how you would do that. But
I don't
my
think you
idea
can.
is
That's my point. Yeah.
my idea being that all of this is towards what all life does, right? All life
Yeah.
is just
Yeah.
trying to survive and propagate. And then honestly, I think to the point that we're at, we're trying to just not only do that, but thrive. And like you
Uh-huh.
said, like, so I think with the formation of consciousness through
But then even
evolution,
that word thrive, what does that mean?
that would be the subjective wellness, like the
Sure.
subjective peak wellness, like the most efficient wellness for the species. Well, it depends. Some people are selfish and they just want it for themselves, but in general sense, it would be these like from a subjective standpoint, coming from the standpoint of the species as a whole, having the most wellness possible. I would say, like
Sure.
having an abundance of
Now,
resources, having being on a couple planets so we get we lose one, we're still good. You know what I mean?
no, fair
Like
enough. Fair enough.
but
But
that's
then
essentially. But if you think of it,
why do we care about that? And okay, so this is a thought exercise I want to go through. I'm going to ask you why a bunch,
yeah.
and yeah, let's just play it
But
out.
it's
And then
just, but it's just
yeah.
that's just cyclical because that's what
No, I don't
because
think it is. I don't think it is cyclical. That's the thing. It's like
okay.
I think that there's a source that actually answers these questions. I don't know. I don't think we actually know the answer, right?
Yeah, I
The
would agree.
best we can do is try to, wrestle with it and try to understand why do we do these things. But what I would say is, like, that's
Well,
the
what if that's
definition of a religious claim. Is what I would
yeah?
say is
What if
you
that's
ask
what if
why a bunch of times and you land on a religious, like, the source, the root of the answer to these questions. I would define as religion.
Well,
And
so then it would almost be ultimately that there is no way to explain it or validate it, and that's the only answer that we can
no,
give to be able to cope with it.
no. Here's
Like,
the tricky part. What you have to do though is sacrifice your life to it. And and it's shitty, but that's what faith is. You're already doing this. Like, you have a set of values and things that you're orienting your life to, and you're sacrificing your life to that. Like, you're doing that. Like, because you're saying, I'm gonna, like, you're not making random decisions. Like, right now, I mean, you're like well behaved. You're not shouting random words and like doing random things with your fingers and stuff. Like, you have an order to you, which means that, like, there's some set of values and principles that are guiding your life, and you can
yes,
modify them and stuff. But
yes, it's my DNA telling me this is what you need to do to survive in this society, because otherwise
fair
you'll
enough.
be
Sure,
outcast. And
sure,
if you're
sure.
outcast, you don't know how to hunt
Yeah,
and
sure,
skin
man.
an animal
Yeah,
and provide yourself with warmth and do all these things that are necessary in a tribe.
right.
And if you are ostracized from the tribe, you die. I think that all of this is
Yeah,
explained by
yeah.
basic survival that
I
is
agree.
imprinted on us
Yeah,
from generations past.
sure.
I don't. Yeah, and I think that trying to be that, it's almost like trying to be like to achieve like being the chieftain of the tribe. Like, it all comes back to some sort of like primal tribal sense to me. That's at least how I explain
I
most of
agree.
the
I
things that
agree.
drive our behavior. If you try to look at your own behavior,
Yeah.
like if you boil it down, I know if you extrapolate this out and you look at us as a species, it starts getting very like difficult to put
Hmm.
your finger on it. But if you kind of bring it back in and look at your own behavior and kind of analyze it, I feel like it's
It's
quite
hard.
easily. Well,
You
I
think
feel like
it's
it's
easy?
quite.
Okay, it's fucking
I
hard, man.
okay.
Why are
Well,
you
why?
attracted to the people you're attracted to?
Okay, well, I'm not
It's
talking about
hard.
being
It's
it.
really
I'm
hard to
not.
know that.
I'm
Yeah,
not
yeah, it's
trying to
really
be.
hard.
Yeah. I'm not saying I can go and dive into like.
Oh, sure,
Obviously, I'd be
exactly,
doing a
sure.
lot better in life, and I wouldn't, need to go to therapy if I could do all
Sure, man,
that.
same,
But,
same, sure.
but, uh,
That's my point, yeah,
but,
yeah. Sure.
I'm talking about just from like I'm talking on like a macro level. You know what I mean? Like, why am I not irate right now? Why am I not waving my hands around and just doing stuff completely unrelated to this? Well, because I know that this is of some sort of interest to me in the betterment, and I'm trying to explore this thought. I want to get to the end of it, and I want to share that
Yeah,
with other people.
yeah,
Things that are generally good for society. That will honestly, I believe everything is out of selfishness. Whether that no way, like however you skin it, right? So
sort of, yeah.
at some level, it's probably because I want to, you know, share these things and probably get some praise for what I think I've learned or whatever, whatever that may be. There
Or
is
it gives
some
your
sort
life
of
meaning to help someone. So even selflessness
well,
is selfish in some sense. I mean,
in some
like,
sense. That's
you
what I
wouldn't
was
do it
getting
if it
at.
didn't give you something that you thought is worth doing or that you
Even if it
want to
was
do.
just
Yeah,
even
yeah,
if it's just feeling good for helping someone, which
yeah.
I think that's the
Thank
ultimate
God we
form
have
of.
that, right? I mean,
Yes,
like that's.
I mean,
I mean, sure. Yeah,
that's as selfless as it gets, and really, like, I wanted to
sure,
talk to you at some point if you believed if objective or subjective was true, but I think that's along the lines of the most objective subjective can get, because I don't, believe there is such thing as objective. You can't see anything outside of the lens you're in. There's,
sure.
objective to what? Once there
So,
must be a subject,
so I
right?
go
So
pretty far. I go pretty far with this. So, yeah. So I guess there's like two realms of this, right? So, and I think we have had a conversation about this a couple years ago,
we
like
did,
something
yeah.
in the ballpark of this, and it's like the idea is, okay, you could talk about objective or just subjective morality, for example, and then you can also do the same thing with like reality in some sense. And you would say something like maybe religion is trying to get at addressing the question of morality in some sense, or like maybe modes of being, but morality is, I think, close enough. And you
Just to
have,
interject real quick, I would just say the creationism, the creation version of God, which I know you were kind of struggling putting those two together, and that's
yeah,
one
yeah,
I struggle with a ton, is the creation version of God. There must be an objective moral truth, right? That's kind of what the argument is.
there must be an objective moral truth. What do you mean by that?
Like so if there was a God that created all of us, there must be an objective moral truth, this God's truth, right? It's essentially the way that I see it. Like if there was a God that created all this, and there is this all exists to appease this God, so to speak, or God created man for man to come back to God or whatever it is.
Mhm.
Well, then there's an objective set of truths based on the principles that God outlines. It's
Yeah,
right.
sure. And science is
How
trying
else
to
do you
figure
get
it
around
out.
it? Well, yeah. Well, how
Yeah,
else
that's
do you get
true.
around it, right? If that's the
No, sure.
case, but then you must believe that everything, the entire universe, everything that we know was created for us, which is preposterous and very
Well, it depends on what you mean
narcissistic.
by us. Like, if you
Yeah.
want to say conscious agents, sure. Like, like I'm not trying to like claim that like this is the human story and that dogs are like they don't have a god and God doesn't give a shit about dogs or something. Like I'm not trying to make that claim at all. Like I would say it's more like
You didn't care about the
consciousness itself.
dinosaurs. Didn't even write them into the Bible. How rude is that?
Well,
Sorry.
maybe the ancient people didn't know about dinosaurs, right? But maybe
Yeah,
in
yeah, yeah.
2,000 years, the dinosaurs will make it into the Bible
The
for them at
rewrite. I
some point.
hope they're making the rewrite, man. They need the
They need
dinosaurs
their day
strike
in
back,
the
episode 3. You know.
That'd be great,
Sorry.
yeah. Like the new story of the New Testament, it's all about like I mean, Revelations is a pretty wacky story, so maybe we can like slap some dinosaurs in there, and
Why
that'll be
not?
fun, yeah.
Why not? Yeah. But yeah.
But all right,
Sorry to derail it a little bit
no,
there.
so
But yeah. So the idea of objective or subjective, like they're really, as you were.
well, okay, so what I would say, okay, I'm trying to think of how to anchor in here because if I just say my claim, it just sounds really wacky. Okay, I'll just start with that, and then maybe you can ask me questions. I actually don't. It's not clear to me that if there wasn't subjects to observe the world, that the world would exist. Like I actually don't. It's not obvious to me. Like suppose somehow all of life is exterminated. Does the universe exist? Like it's actually not clear to me, and I even would err on the side of no. Like the universe exists because conscious agents observe its existence, and so then it's so you actually can't fully separate subject from object, and in some sense like I hope this doesn't like kill my career to get like too woo about this, but like quantum mechanics almost says this, right? I mean, quantum mechanics almost says like there's something about the observer that matters, right? And it's kind of like the electron is doing like it has a bunch of possibilities that it could be until you observe it and then it picks one. And so there's like, you can extract out some kind of philosophical claim about this, but what the hell does that mean? Like what is going on with the electron? And it's kind of like, it's just a sea of potential until a conscious agent observes it. And that the act of observation actually brings existence into being. And it's so it's and I think this is actually part of why I've gone into religion and I found religion to be useful is that like what the hell do you do with that? Like it almost feels like science by quantum mechanics is like it's hit a brick wall. It's hit a brick wall that it's like that like we have absolutely no idea how to explain that aspect of quantum mechanics. Like the fact that like somehow the subject has re-entered into the theory, and the act of observation is important. Like if you look at other scientific theories, like it doesn't say like, oh, you have some subject that observes something and then something happens. It's like, no, this is objectively true about nature. Like this is just some objectively true things, like stars are made out of this and atoms are this. But then quantum mechanics says like, well, what really is going on with an atom? And it's the best that we can say is like, okay, there's a bunch of different options that could happen with the electron, but when I observe it, that's when I actually get something that's, meaningful and useful. And so, like, what I would say is the distinction between subject and object is actually blurred. Like, it's actually blurred. And it's not as clear cut as I would say science hoped it was.
That's a yeah.
It's a kind of far out there idea. Like, it's, but it's.
Yeah, the problem for me is I don't fully understand quantum physics enough. Like I know this has to do with like Schrodinger, like that's kind of his thing, right? Where he's talking about like the observed nature. It's like Schrodinger's cat or something like that, where it's like you can't tell for sure.
It's
until
both
you
dead
observe.
and alive
It's
at the same time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Until
That's
you
what the
observe
theory
it, and
says. It's literally dead and alive at the same time.
Yeah.
Until you observe it. Yeah.
Until someone yeah.
Yeah.
But I wonder. I mean, so here's the thing. It just gets into this like realm of me like making random guesses about something I'm completely uneducated on. So I don't want this to devolve into that exactly.
Fair enough.
But it's like just from a high level, it's almost like well, maybe is the approach that we're coming at of. I mean, here's the thing: at the end of the day, if something's not measuring it, then how could we ever have a measurement?
Right, sure, sure.
So
But
maybe it's
then,
maybe it's the science of measuring that. Maybe this is the length that the science of measuring can go. Like
sure.
maybe that's just how. Maybe that's just the nature of measuring. I don't know.
I actually
There's
think it's a fundamental thing. So this is definitely an aside, but like this is one thing I've been thinking about with quantum mechanics, and it says something like when you try to measure something, it changes it, which is another way of saying how can you actually get at objective truth if every time you try to get it, you're actually modifying it. So like whatever the hell's going on there, when I look at it, it changes. And then so you can see this like anytime you try to measure something, it's modifying actually the thing that you're measuring. And like look at this in school. Look at this with grades, right? Like grades do this. Like, if like I definitely felt this way in undergrad. It was, it was like, okay, there's a bunch of ideas and it's really cool. And I just want to like kind of, I'm interested in a bunch of ideas. But then once the fact that there's a grade there and there's something measuring me, it modifies actually how I do school. And it's like, okay, I want to do this interesting thing in physics. And I really like this idea and I want to spend time on that, but I know it's not going to be on the exam, so I'm not going to spend time on it. But that wouldn't happen unless there was a measurement device that told me like, hey, we're going to measure you on this way and we want you to, do a particular
we want this
thing.
outcome.
Right. Yeah.
We want this outcome in this exact method, regardless of your passion of the thing, but you got to do this trick.
Right. And I
that
actually
happens at work too. So
no, it does. Exactly. Yeah. Yeah. Especially right. Because then you have like these, what are they called? Like, you have these like kind of reports every once in a while. You have
performance review. You have performance reviews. And like,
Yeah.
honestly, dude, I was in a meeting the other day and, someone was talking about their personal hobby and one of our like, aspiring manager guys was talking about how he could turn that into like, oh, you could turn that into like something for your performance review. I'm like, can you just let him have a damn hobby? Like, Jesus, man, it's just our job. Like,
wait, so he had a hobby outside of work and they were having a problem
it was like
with
a
the fact
show and tell. Well, it was the show and tell type thing, but then the manager was like, "Oh, you could show impact at work through that." It's like, bro, just let him have a hobby. Like, everything doesn't have to be impact at work. It's just these people that are trained through academics, through elementary school, middle school, high school, college, then they get into the workforce and they just act like it's still school, and it just blows my mind that people operate like that.
Here's what
like,
I
bro,
would say.
This is reality. Like,
right.
You should have other stuff out of here, including interests that you do not mix with your job. Like, God.
Yeah, so to tie this back to religion. No. Like, this is an important point, though. Like, to tie this back to religion, it's like, in some sense, the boss, he has a certain things of what he's calling valuable and what he's, prioritizing. And that it's kind of like, work above all else. Like, the only thing that matters is your job, right? And it's almost like this is a god. Like, that belief, there's a god that's associated with holding as the highest value. It's something like profit above all else. Right? Or it's like, the business above all else. It's work above all else. And it's like, and I think that this God is definitely, possessing our society a lot and has a lot of influence on our society. And it's like, in a lot of ways, that's like one of the biggest problems, and then
it is a massive problem.
Right. And what you can say, like if you were to take the religious language, you could say that our society is worshiping a false idol. And like, I think it's like it's a good description of it because it's kind of like, if you look at this, it's driving us off a cliff.
Well, also,
and then there's stories in the Bible about this. I mean, it's like, what happens when you worship a false idol? Like, that's the story of Lucifer. And no, sure.
I was listening to your video about that, where you're talking about like go Google like narcissists and go to like a forum and read that stuff. And I was like, that's actually really accurate. Dude, Netflix documentary, the Doc Antle story about like the Tiger King stuff. Bro, it's like like pretty plain and cut. Like the dude murders his friend and like now he's got all these. Dude, it's crazy. Yeah. It's crazy. It's like really the story of the narcissist, and they kind of fabricate their own story around them. It's like pretty straight cut what you were explaining in that.
And that story's really ancient, I mean, and it's like, we know what happens when you do that. And, okay, this is an interesting one this is a bit of a tangent. Well, it's related to this idea. Go ahead, yeah.
Just before you went off that one, I really like the idea, don't lose that thought, but the idea of it being gods, I like that it gives terminology to, like, I can just say, worshiping a false idol or something like that, and then you can understand now that I'm talking about a
Right.
set of ideals or a set of moral beliefs
Good.
that are in opposition to the divine good, right? Of what's
Good.
good for all of society, and
Right.
that is nice to have verbiage for that.
Yeah,
So,
no, this is why like people are like, oh, why don't you just come up with new terms? It's like because we already have a term for that. You know, I mean,
well,
it's
yeah,
like
it's actually
yeah,
pretty
no, it's like
good.
yeah, no, it's like like people are like, oh, I don't like the word God, whatever, and it's like, why don't you come up with a new term? And it's like, well, it's kind of like like this happens in science. Like there's a reason why we have a vocabulary. We have a vocabulary because if everybody just creates new terms all the time for things, then we don't have a shared experience of ways to communicate stuff. And so in a lot of ways, like that's what religion does. It plants you in a story and gives you a framework to view the world and it
Yeah,
and it
we are
it
story driven too
endows
as a
it
species.
does
We really are story
right
driven. It's
yeah
like a way, and
and
it's almost like that personification is a really important element to us. It really obviously is culturally, like, in our behavior, in the way that we interact with each other. Like when you think about the fabrics of society, like how we learn from each other is mostly through, like, forms of media. Like we tell stories to each other. So honestly, that's
right
kind of where it comes back to.
right
It's almost like, yeah, I mean, I think this stuff works in tandem, in parallel, like, very well. I don't think that there's any opposition really at all here. I think that it's just,
yeah
you know,
yeah
I think that some people may be more or less, like, off put by it being religion. I think that
I
really
know
has to do with the way, honestly, like what they were talking about in
PTSD
that.
to be honest. I mean
Yes, yes.
yeah, no,
Well,
sure man I
dude,
get
it's
it.
been bad. It's been
Oh I
bad. We'll
know it
talk
has
about
yeah.
worshiping false idols, like everything going on with
Sure yeah.
Catholic priests and
No
whatnot.
man
Like,
yeah no I'm with
obviously
you on that yeah
obviously telling these people to go celibate and then having them, like, you got to rewrite some rules. This obviously isn't
no
healthy.
agreed
Organized religion, that's a problem, is that organized religion is truly a bastardization of what the spiritual connection between God and you should be. Because think about this, like, look at the hierarchy, the political hierarchy of the Catholic Church.
hmm
Those people are not saints, it's just clearly.
not all of them no 100% some of them are and like here's the thing is I actually think the organization is actually important. I think it's like fundamental, like you need it. And like one of the things that like the reason you need it is that it like it's a symbol of like it's a the actual church. It's a representation of being itself. Because I think one of the key differences between psychology and psychoanalysis and religion is the difference between looking only as yourself and as a collective. And what the goal in some sense of religion and like the perfect religion would be one that unifies all of us, right? And so what you do need to have in some sense, like what you want to have is some system that binds all of us together and unifies all of us. Now, like I think that because humans are flawed, so like I guess what I would say is if you look at the Catholic Church's history, there's a lot of bad things. Like I'm not even going to try to say that it wasn't bad. It was horrendous, right? Between like the whole Manifest Destiny, between like definitely a lot of colonialism, like different like all the Crusades, and then Catholic priests that are with all these child abuse scandals. Like it's bad. It's bad. But what I would say is like what is bad about that is the fact that humans are flawed. It's not the organized religion. Like you need a structure. And what I would say is like the church, like what the church is supposed to be is something like, and it's something like a representation, like it's acting out being itself. Like when you go into church and you engage in these activities and then you take, like if you engage in communion and Christianity, it's like you're actually role playing, you're acting out different aspects of being itself. And then like the church is supposed to be a symbol of, like civilization. And it's like there's so it's like I don't think you can just have people that each have their own gods that we worship. Like there's something about we need to all be worshiping the same God or it's kind of mayhem. Like but the question is what is the God that unifies all of us? And I think one of the big problems with organized religion is they somehow try to claim that they know. And they don't. No one knows. If you did know, you are God. Right? And like at best, God has been on earth one time, and it's not you. And it's none of us, right? I mean it's And like, it depends on which religion. I mean, if you
Yeah.
practice Islam, then it's like there is no God on earth ever. And so like there's some aspects of that I actually,
Yeah. No, that
kind of
sounds more
agree with
reasonable
more.
to me.
Yeah, I know, yeah. But then they have other aspects that
Yeah.
I struggle with, So I mean, it's like if it's going
Yeah.
to be true of any religion. And
Yep, you can't agree with all of it and from any of them, but there's good parts of all of them. I think that we can
I agree.
definitely
I would
agree, you
agree.
know?
I would agree. And
Well
and
well, what do you think about boiling down each of them to, like what I think happens is there's too much on top of everything, right? And really what I think that comes down to is kind of the corporate nature, the capitalistic nature of the church where you're collecting tithing and you're building an organization. I would almost argue that the organization is what corrupts, right? Once you start bringing tithing and money and positions and power into it,
but it's
like
unavoidable.
well, I mean, I would
Yeah.
agree with you. I think that corruption's a natural part
No,
of
even the organization though, I think it's
oh,
unavoidable to like we're
power distributes. It's almost like
but we
in
need
a
a
economic
hierarchy.
system. It's
Like,
almost like an economic system. No matter which economic system that you use, wealth distributes in the same way.
well, it's also the hierarchy
Roughly the
though.
same way.
Because like in some sense,
Yeah.
like a religious organization, there's a hierarchy to it. Like
Yeah.
in the Catholic Church, I mean, it's like you have the Pope, and then you have I don't even actually know all the things. There's like popes, bishops,
Bishops and
deacons, and
knights,
deacons.
rook.
Yeah, whatever it is. Oh, sure, yeah, yeah. There's all these things, right? I mean, like there's a whole hierarchy to it, and but like, okay, the biggest problem I have with the Catholic Church is the belief that somehow it's like this idea that like, for example, the Pope is infallible, right? Like he is perfect essentially, like he's basically God, and and then like even locally in a church, like oftentimes it almost feels like the priest is talking like. Oh, God, I just got off the phone with God today, and He gave me this sermon. To tell you, and it's kind of like, okay,
Yeah.
like I'm not a fan of that, right? And
Yeah. I agree.
but so there's this guy, one of the 4 people in that video that I recommended. This guy, Bishop Barron. He's a Catholic bishop, and he's the Bishop of California, some area of California. And his approach, I'm a huge fan of because he agrees with me, and he talks about like his view on the Catholic Church is like it's breaking away from that. It's like realizes like, okay, that's the wrong way to look at things. We all are sinners, and then he's okay saying I don't know, and he's okay, and that gives me hope. Like it's kind of like, okay, this is a way better way to be viewing these things rather than somehow. And it's like it's okay that you don't know. It's okay that you don't know, and I think that because a lot of people struggle with it. It's like teachers struggle with this, and this was always one of my problems as a student at university. Is that like an instructor? They feel like they have to know everything, and if a student asks them a question they don't know, that somehow that's like an attack on their right to that position. And in some sense,
Yeah.
it is, right? In some sense, it actually is an attack on the right to their position. Because I mean, if every question a student asks you have no answer for, what the hell are you doing as a professor? So it's like it's tricky.
This
There's
might be a
this
higher
weird
education
tension.
thing. This must
But
be a
it's the
higher
same thing,
education
I think, in the
'cause
church, though, right?
Oh,
Well,
yeah, yeah.
but what about with your manager, maybe? Maybe you have a similar
Well,
thing at work,
I have a
right?
great manager, but my manager's
Good, man.
awesome.
That's great. Yeah,
Yeah.
good, man. That's good. Yeah, but I've definitely heard, like I know, like in high school, I had managers like this, where it was like very just like this is the law, period, and don't question me. And it's like if you were sitting in a church and you were the priest of a church, and you got 300 people looking to you for guidance, like there's something about you have to be worthy of being someone that can give advice and talk to people and preach to people and try to like tell them something to orient their life around. I mean, there's a lot of responsibility in being a priest, and I think that like the problem is actually it's a flaw of human. It's like an insecurity to feel like, okay, for me to actually be giving advice to all these people, I have to know everything. I have to know what the hell I'm talking about. If I tell you should act this way, like I better know what the hell I'm talking about, or I shouldn't be up here giving advice.
100%.
But then I
Yeah.
think the correct way is to reformulate this and say it's kind of like, look, we're in this together, and
We'll
then
help
on this
guide
journey,
that discovery, yeah.
like we're walking the same path. I'm several steps ahead of you, right? And I'm trying to guide you to not, fuck up in the same ways I did. But then you're going to be on a path that's, slightly different than mine, and I'm going to seek guidance from you. and it's like I think that this is a better cosmology in some sense. It's like, each person has a role, like if everybody was a monk, like literally there's one more generation of our society and everyone dies because you have to be celibate, you're not allowed to have kids, so you can't have everybody be a monk. Like you need monks, you need someone
We
at
could
the
have a lot
grocery
more
store
for
that,
sure. We could have a
yeah,
lot more. That would deal with a lot of problems.
yeah, no, exactly, like you can't, like every role is essential, but it's like we need all of each
Yeah.
other, right? And it's not like the priest is above us. Like the
Yeah.
priest
Well,
has a
that's
role to serve, but then he needs us as much as we need him. And there's like
that
there's a,
reciprocal, the reciprocal,
right. That's the problem.
nature to that relationship. It really needs to be highlighted, and that needs to be what it is. I think one major issue, honestly, like Catholicism needs a rebrand, and you need to
Mm-hmm.
completely gut the hierarchy. You need to come. So what you need to do is you need to have the celibate thing needs to go away, and then you need to get rid of the entire.
That's
No, it needs to go
tricky.
away. Check this out. Check this out. Just hear me out on this one. Celibate thing goes away, then you restart the entire hierarchy with people that aren't pedophiles, and then we go from there. Like
Well,
I'm
it's
telling you,
tricky. It's
to
tricky.
get
It's
the general public foot
uh,
in the door on Catholicism, that needs to happen. Otherwise, you are literally giving your money to a child trafficking ring. Like that's the way that I see it from an outside
fair
perspective.
enough,
And
man. Fair
like
enough.
far,
Yeah, and
full stop. Like
so there are other churches that do this. So I believe. Okay, I'm not gonna say because I don't know enough, but there are other
yeah,
denominations that like essentially are like, okay, we're gonna remove that aspect and we're gonna remove this celibacy requirement on like our religious leaders in some sense because it's too much of a price to bear, like it's too much of a sacrifice, and it's kind of like what's tricky about it though is there is something about sacrificing that I think is of value. It's insanely hard. I'm not saying it's easy, but it's
hasn't been
like,
going well historically.
well,
They haven't
it
been
actually
sacrificing it
has.
all the
It
way.
had
Been
like, okay,
sacrificing other people.
there's like the vast majority of
The lamb is
priests,
being sacrificed.
the vast majority of priests have not engaged in uh like child molestation. I mean, it's like it's enough that it's widespread and everybody knows it, but it's small enough that it's kind of like, okay, like I don't want to get too much into politics, but if you turn on Fox News, like 2 years ago when the BLM protests were going on, it was something like every BLM protest is fire and mayhem and chaos, but it's like no, like there's actually been like thousands of BLM protests,
It was
and
just like
there's a
Portland.
few of
They
them.
just keep going to
Yeah,
Portland.
no, sure, and a few of them were bad, but then
Yeah.
it was like the entire brand, like if you were kind of more on the right, the entire brand is now tarnished, and it's kind of like, okay,
Or same thing with Proud
yeah,
Boys and stuff on the right. It was like,
exactly,
vice
sure,
versa. It's
right,
just
right,
it's just a well, that's what the
right,
media does. And honestly, the
sure,
media is
right.
it's a dying breed that literally gets its life force from extrapolating out small issues into big ones because fear-driven behavior is what you can capitalize on.
And like Jordan Peterson talks about this. That's almost like a sign of the fact that it is dying, and like it's partially sad because there is something about the mainstream media and the fact that like it's supposed to be fact checked and it's supposed to have like there's a whole system about trying to keep it organized. But what the problem is the fact that because the internet is blowing
Well,
up,
we're gonna
it's
start
like,
getting into we're going to quickly get into politics with this one because that has to
yeah,
do
fair
with
enough,
the
yeah.
regulation, the people from those companies being put on the regulatory body chairs. So then they
Mhm.
regulate their own companies, and then you turn Fox News into Fox Entertainment News. No one's accountable
Fine,
for the
right.
information. So,
But then
anyways,
nobody really knows that. But yeah, no, fair enough. Yeah, fair enough. Yeah, no, fair enough, man. Yeah, yeah, fair enough. Like, yeah, yeah, agreed.
but yeah, so I think that at this point, so I guess I don't, we've kind of gone on through a couple of different topics here, but so we went through kind of the my kind of point on the evolution of biology thing, and we've kind of come to the agreement that we're just this it's semantics, like you can describe it one way or another. But what something you brought up that was really interesting is almost like that the idea of this subjective, like how I said there is no objective, no such thing as objective. It almost is like when you're
I
talking
wouldn't say
about
that. I wouldn't say that there's no such thing as objective. Yeah, that I was saying it's actually very, very difficult to separate subject from object. But then there is
gotcha.
another discussion that if we talk about objective truths, that maybe that's
Yeah,
what we're trying to get
okay,
into
let's
here.
yeah, what would you say is an objective truth? Because I just don't
I don't
see
know. Yeah.
I don't see anything in which we can remove ourselves from the subjective point to
Yeah.
measure or make any sort of statement on it, and then like nothing can ever escape. There's as objective as subjective can get. Objective is almost this really gets into kind of semantics again as well, but it's like you can say everything but like we could say like, okay, objective meaning not all living things, so just like planets and forces and whatnot, but like at the end of the day it all has to be measured against something, otherwise it's nothing, right? Then
Sure.
you're just you have no context.
Yeah, so I
But
thought about this question. It was actually strange. Like in 2020, I mean, 2020 was a really strange year. I guess probably actually for everyone. But
yeah, for sure.
uh, I remember there was like for like a month straight, I was obsessed with the question of objective morality. Like obsessed. It was really strange. Like out of nowhere, I remember talking to like my philosophy friend. We had like one discussion about it, and then we were talking about objective morality, and then I just like kept talking to him like every day for like a month, and he was even like, dude, like you were really into this, like maybe you picked the wrong field, you should go to philosophy, and I remember basically, okay, at the end of the month I was kind of like, I don't think objective morality exists, and in fact I don't even think objective reality exists. Like I don't think we can actually objectively
Prove
know
that.
anything. And
Yeah.
then my views have shifted a bit now, and it's funny because I was like, okay, objective morality. Like it started with, okay, objective morality does exist, and I watched this video with William Lane Craig and someone else. William Lane Craig is like a philosopher that is also religious, and he's like clinical philosophical talking about religious ideas, and fairly interesting guy. But anyway, he had this argument that if objective morality exists, then God exists. And so at the time, I didn't believe in God, or I think actually everybody believes in God, but I didn't. Anyway, I don't want to go down that wormhole.
No, it makes
But
sense.
but then yeah, I remember watching this, and I was kind of like, oh yeah, that was really interesting, because one of my friends just got into religion, started going to church and everything, and he showed me this and was like, yeah, like look, man, like if we have objective morality, then God exists. Like here's a pretty good argument. It's convincing. And then I remember watching that, and I was kind of like, okay, I'm convinced that if objective morality exists, God exists. But then it was kind of like, well, maybe objective morality doesn't exist. And then I spent like a month thinking about this question. And then kind of the conclusion actually was that objective morality doesn't exist. And then I like kind of like really got into this postmodern lens of, which like there's a lot of compelling aspects of postmodernism, but without going like too deep into that, it was kind of like, okay, like the reason I was saying objective morality doesn't exist is because I was using the lens of science, and I was saying like objective in the sense of scientific truth. But then I was like, okay, like I don't know if we can say that objective morality exists, because it's kind of like, you know, like essentially my definition of true was too strict. But then I realized like, okay, this definition of true, like something that's rigorously, irrefutably 100% true. And then I was kind of like, we can't even say this in science. Like, the only thing you can do is falsify a claim, but we don't know anything is rigorously, objectively true. And it's kind of like, then I went down this rabbit hole of like, okay, what is true? And it was like, with my definition of true, of just rigorously, like true in like, like if you take a math class, it's like, okay, I'm going to set out some principles, and from there, this thing's true, and it's insanely rigorous. But then it was like, essentially all I come up with is like, it's true that I exist, probably. It's like, and it was kind of like, okay, if that's about as far as I can get with this definition of true, maybe I should scratch that. And then, but then I was also thinking in the terms of science. And so if you look at science, like kind of the goal is we're trying to get at objective truth about the natural world, like about the, about the natural world. And what I would say is this, though, like if you look at the theories that we have, so if you look at Newton's conception of mechanics, he like sets up these principles, and he's like, for every action there's an equal and opposite reaction, and the sum of the forces, they go to mass times acceleration, and whatever. He has kind of this framework, and he's like, hey, we have this framework, and it's great, and we can predict stuff. But then you could ask, okay, is that framework true? It's kind of like, what does that mean? What is, and then it turns out that like experiments actually came out that falsified it. And it was kind of like, okay, well, it's actually not true. And it's kind of there's this joke in the physics community that it's like it's like, yeah, like like F is equal to ma, except when it's not. And it's kind of like, well, that's not really like super helpful because like, well, when is it not? But then but then Einstein came along and he came up with his theory of relativity, and first he had the special theory of relativity and then the general theory of relativity, and then you could ask the same question: is Einstein's theory true? And it's like, well, who knows? But then what you can say though is that Einstein's theory of relativity is more true than Newton's theory of mechanics. And the reason is because everything that's in Newton's laws is also in Einstein's. But it can explain more things. And so then what this gives you actually is that there's a form of better. There's better and better theories. So what's the best theory? That's truth. So then I would say, okay, well, objective reality exists. That's how I went from, okay, objective morality exists. Objective morality probably doesn't exist. Objective reality actually probably doesn't exist. And then, like, if you're in that part, like that, like from my perspective, that place is hell. Like, if you're in a place where it's like that's actually my conception of hell. And it's funny, like, I'm probably not doing it on camera because, it's too intimate. But when I think about that place, it actually brings tears to my eyes because it was just, being there was so unbearable. It was so unbearable to be where it's like, literally, it's like, I don't know if anything is true. And it's just kind of like, what the hell do you do? Like, what do you do if you're in a position where, like, nothing is true? I don't know. Maybe. I mean, it's like, to me, that's the closest thing I've experienced to hell. But then it was like, okay, this idea that you can have better and better models, it's like, in some sense, we're progressing towards something, but what we're progressing towards is capital T true. And so what I would say, so the way I would formulate it now is that objective reality exists, but it's unknowable. And so, it's like tricky, but we can get better and better at it. We can get closer and closer to it. But then it was like, okay, well, maybe that same argument applies to morality. And that's where I would say, yes, actually. That's the idea of religion. And this is why I struggle a bit with actually Christ being the literal Son of God. It's tricky. But what I want to say is you can apply the same reasoning. Is that, we have better and better modes of being. Right? And then it's like, there's certain things that are just obviously good. Right? And it's like, if I shoot you in the face, you think that's obviously bad. It's like, and if that's not obvious to you, it's like, I actually feel sorry for you. Okay, fair enough. Fair enough. But yeah, if you're a bad person, but then the fact that we even can talk about this, and it's like, like most of us are going to look at Hitler and say that was bad. It's like, okay, like killing that many Jews is bad. Killing that many anybody is bad. We don't do that, all right? And it's like we all just kind of know that that's bad. And it's like, okay, whatever the principles and values that led to that, let's not do that. And so then it's like, okay, that's worse than whatever principles and morals lead to, like, let's even say just what we're doing now, right? This is better than that. This is better than Nazism. Like hopefully that's not even controversial. And if it is controversial, I don't know if I want to say this, but
no, it's not. It's not.
It's not controversial. But what I would say is, like, if it is controversial, you're like, I don't mean this as an insult. I recommend going to therapy. I would, yeah. I went to therapy. Agree with that. Yeah, I mean, I was there. I went to therapy. I got out of that. And anyway, so you could do the same thing with morality. You could say that there's better and better modes of being. And in some sense, that's what I would say is the point of the religious text. What it's saying is, like, over time, we've documented these stories. And then even in the Bible, if you look at the Old Testament, there's, like, better and better people. And they're all pointing to, like, oh, there's going to be a best person coming. And they're pointing to Jesus Christ. But it's like, you see a progression of people getting better and better and understanding and forming a stronger relationship with the divine, with God himself, and trying to establish a better and better mode of being. And then it's like, okay, well, we're progressing to something. And the end point of that is objective morality. So what's objectively good. And like, but almost the definition in some sense of what is objectively good is God. And so, like, and it is also in agreement with this Orthodox Christian view of theosis, is that we're progressing towards, being reunited with God, understanding what is objectively good and what
I would
is
I would still
objectively
I would
true.
still yeah, I would say we have to, I guess, put like a definition because we're gonna get in semantics, like
Hmm.
semantics breakdown that's kind of unnecessary. But objective as something can get through a subjective lens, because it's
Yeah,
at the end
sure,
of the
fair
day,
enough.
we're talking about objective as from a human perspective, talking about the objective viewpoint of humanity being the objective and
Hmm.
us being the subjective. Because like otherwise, there's no yeah. Anyways,
Yeah, and
objective
so
doesn't really work, but.
right, so that's why like the view that I have right now is that objective reality and objective morality exists, but it's unknowable. And one of my friends says like that statement's actually objective. I'm asserting an objective truth to say that objective truth is unknowable. But I was thinking about this. I'm like, I would say that's actually a belief. That's a belief that I have that it's unknowable. And like the story of Jesus Christ actually shatters this because he is an example of the ideal in incarnate, right? I mean, and I don't know what to do with that. I don't know what to make of that. I mean, it's it's literally unbelievable. It's literally unbelievable. But then it's also unbelievable to think that that was completely fabricated. So I don't know. I mean, I don't know how to fully make sense of that one, and I don't know. Yeah, but
No,
yeah,
that's fair.
yeah,
But yeah, man, I think I don't think I have anything else for this one. I think we went through all my talking points. I definitely had a nice kind of exploration of stuff I hadn't really thought to talk about at the end. But yeah, how are you feeling on this one?
yeah. I'm feeling great. I mean, it's at an hour and a half, and I'm starting to get brain fog. So I think this is probably a good
Perfect.
place to stop. I feel like we covered a lot of ground, and yeah, hopefully this is of interest to my viewers and those of you that are watching. And then I guess to you, Max, also, if you'd ever like to come back on the podcast, you know where to find me. And then to the viewers too, if you want to be next, great. I'm still a very small channel, and I'm looking for people to talk to. So definitely if you would also like to come on and talk about some of these ideas, or you have questions, leave a comment down below and or join the Discord channel, and then we can try to set something up from there. And until next time, guys, take care.
Peace.